When 19-year-old Ayanna Clearwater was banished from her Apache tribe for carrying a white man's child, she thought death in the wilderness was certain. But when a mysterious mountain man appeared at her darkest hour and began building her a cabin with his own hands, she discovered that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. What she didn't know was that this stranger harbored secrets that would change everything she believed about her past, her future, and the father of her unborn child. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Arizona Territory, March 1883. The Sonoran Desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast expanse of saguaro cacti and unforgiving terrain, where temperatures could kill a person in hours, and water was more precious than gold. Against this harsh backdrop, a lone figure stumbled through the scrub brush, her bare feet bleeding from the sharp rocks and thorns that littered the ground. Ayanna Clearwater pressed one hand to her swollen belly while using the other to steady herself against a towering saguaro. At 19 years old and 7 months pregnant, she had been walking for 3 days since her banishment from the San Carlos reservation. The tribal council's words still echoed in her memory like the cries of hunting hawks. She had brought shame upon her people by lying with a white man, and no amount of pleading or explanation could change their judgment. The child within her kicked restlessly, as if protesting the harsh conditions its mother had been forced to endure. Ayanna whispered soft Apache lullabies her grandmother had taught her, trying to calm both the baby and her own racing heart. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning her dark hair into a furnace and making every breath feel like swallowing fire. She had been the daughter of Standing Bear, a respected warrior who had died fighting the cavalry 5 years earlier. Her mother, Morning Star, had succumbed to tuberculosis the following winter, leaving Ayanna in the care of her grandmother, Silver Moon. For years, she had been known as one of the most promising young women on the reservation, skilled in traditional crafts and fluent in both Apache and English from her time at the mission school. But all of that changed 6 months ago when she met Captain James Dalton of the United States Army. He had come to the reservation as part of a diplomatic mission, tasked with negotiating new treaty terms with the tribal leadership. Unlike the other soldiers, Dalton had shown genuine respect for Apache customs and had taken time to learn basic phrases in their language. Ayanna had been assigned to serve as a translator during the negotiations, spending long hours in Dalton's company as they worked through complex legal documents and cultural misunderstandings. What began as professional respect slowly blossomed into something deeper, despite the vast gulf that separated their two worlds. Dalton was different from the other white men she had encountered. He listened when she spoke, asked thoughtful questions about Apache traditions, and never looked at her with the mixture of fear and contempt that characterized most military personnel. When he spoke of his own past, she learned that he had grown up on a farm in Ohio, the son of German immigrants who had taught him the value of hard work and treating all people with dignity. Their relationship developed in secret, stolen moments, during official meetings and carefully planned encounters, away from the watchful eyes of both army officers and tribal elders. Dalton would bring her books from the fort's library, introducing her to poetry and literature she had never imagined existed. In return, she shared stories of Apache history and taught him to identify the subtle signs that predicted weather changes in the desert. For 3 months, they maintained the dangerous fiction that their relationship was purely professional. But love, like water in the desert, finds a way to flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. When Dalton was reassigned to a post in New Mexico Territory, they both knew their time together was ending. The night before his departure, they met one final time at a hidden spring 2 miles from the reservation. Under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch, they made love with the desperate intensity of people who knew they might never see each other again. Dalton promised to write, to find a way to return to her, to somehow bridge the impossible, divide between their two worlds. But promises made under starlight often fade in the harsh light of day. Dalton's letters came sporadically at first, then stopped entirely. When Ayana realized she was pregnant, she faced the devastating choice between revealing her secret and trying to hide her condition until the baby was born. She chose secrecy, wearing loose clothing and avoiding situations where her changing body might be noticed. For months, the deception worked. Her grandmother suspected something but asked no direct questions, perhaps hoping that silence might somehow make the problem disappear. The truth came out during the sunrise ceremony, a sacred Apache ritual that marked a girl's transition to womanhood. As the spiritual leader, medicine man Joseph Crow Feather, performed the traditional blessings, his weathered hands touched Ayana's belly in a gesture meant to invoke fertility and health in her future marriage. The moment his palms pressed against her dress, Crowfeather's eyes widened with shock and recognition. The life growing within her was unmistakable to someone trained in the ancient ways of reading the human body's subtle changes. His expression shifted from blessing to condemnation, and Ayana knew her secret was revealed. The tribal council convened the next morning. Ayana stood before the assembled elders, her head held high, despite the shame burning in her chest like swallowed coals. Chief Red Cloud, a man she had known since childhood, looked at her with profound disappointment rather than anger. "You have brought the blood of our enemies into your womb," he said in Apache, his voice heavy with the weight of tradition and survival. "This child will be neither white nor Apache, belonging fully to neither world. Such mixing weakens both peoples and dishonors the memory of those who died fighting the white soldiers." Ayana tried to explain about Dalton, about his respect for their culture and his different nature compared to other soldiers. She spoke of love transcending racial boundaries and the possibility that her child might serve as a bridge between two peoples who had known only war. But her words fell on ears deafened by generations of conflict and betrayal. The elders had seen too many treaties broken, too many promises shattered, too many Apache children taken to distant boarding schools and returned as strangers to their own people. The idea that love could conquer such historical animosity seemed naive at best, dangerous at worst. The sentence was swift and absolute: banishment. Ayana would be given food and water for 3 days, then escorted to the reservation boundary and forbidden to return. She would face the wilderness alone, with no weapons, no horse, and no shelter beyond the clothes on her back. Her grandmother, Silver Moon, had wept openly as the sentence was pronounced. But tribal law was immutable. Even family bonds could not override the collective decision of the council. The old woman had pressed a small leather pouch into Ayana's hands as she was led away, whispering, "Your grandfather's medicine bundle. May it protect you and the child." Now, 3 days later, Ayana felt the last of her strength ebbing away like water poured onto hot sand. The food and water the tribe had provided were exhausted, and the desert showed no mercy to those who could not provide for themselves. She had seen no sign of other human beings, no indication that civilization existed anywhere in this vast wasteland of stone and thorn. The baby kicked again, more urgently this time, and Ayana pressed both hands to her belly in response. "Not yet, little one," she whispered in Apache. "We must find shelter first, find water. Then you can join this difficult world." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, Ayana spotted something that made her heart leap with hope. Smoke. A thin line of grey smoke rising from behind a ridge of red rock about a mile to the north. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant human presence. And human presence, even if hostile, offered more hope than the certain death that awaited her if she continued wandering. Alone in the desert, summoning reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, Ayana forced herself to walk toward the smoke. Each step was agony, each breath a conscious effort, but the possibility of survival drove her forward through the gathering dusk. As she crested the ridge, she saw a sight that seemed almost like a mirage. Below her, in a protected valley fed by a natural spring, stood a partially constructed log cabin. The walls were chest-high, built from pine logs that must have been carried down from the mountains visible in the distance. A fire burned in a ring of stones, sending up the smoke she had seen from miles away. Working beside the cabin, his shirt off and his muscled back glistening with sweat despite the cooling evening air, was a white man unlike any she had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the heavy logs he was maneuvering into place. His hair was the color of winter wheat, bleached nearly white by sun and weather, and his beard was full but carefully trimmed. What struck her most was not his size or his obvious strength, but the meticulous care with which he worked. Each log was carefully selected, each joint precisely cut, each angle measured with the patience of someone building for permanence rather than mere shelter. This was not a temporary camp or a crude lean-to, but the foundation of a real home. As Ayana watched from the ridge, the man paused in his work and looked directly up at her hiding place, as if her presence had somehow registered in his peripheral awareness. His eyes, even at this distance, seemed to be the color of deep water, and his expression showed neither surprise nor alarm at discovering he was being observed. Instead, he simply stood up, wiped his hands on a cloth, and called out in accented but clear Apache, "If you are hungry, there is food by the fire. If you are thirsty, the spring runs clean and cold. You are welcome here." The shock of hearing her native language spoken by a white stranger nearly caused Ayana to lose her footing on the loose rock of the ridge. In her weakened condition, the gesture of unexpected kindness was almost overwhelming. She had prepared herself for rejection, hostility, or worse. The simple offer of food and water, delivered in her own tongue, seemed like a miracle, but years of survival instinct cautioned against trusting too readily. White men who spoke Apache were often military scouts or Indian agents, people whose job was to track and capture runaway reservation inhabitants. This could be a trap, a way to lure her down from the safety of the high ground so she could be easily captured and return to face even harsher punishment. The man seemed to understand her hesitation. Instead of approaching or trying to coax her down, he simply returned to his work, positioning another log with the same careful precision he had shown before. His actions suggested that her presence was noted but not threatening, that she could make her own decision about whether to trust him without pressure or coercion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The baby kicked again, and Ayana's empty stomach cramped with a pain that reminded her of her desperate situation. Trust might be dangerous, but starvation and exposure were certain death. Sometimes survival requires choosing between different kinds of risk. Slowly, carefully, she began picking her way down the rocky slope toward the valley floor. The man continued working, occasionally glancing in her direction but making no sudden movements that might frighten her away. As she drew closer, she could see that he was even larger than he had appeared from a distance, with arms corded with muscle and hands that seemed capable of crushing stone. But his movements were gentle, almost delicate, as if he understood that His size could be intimidating and was consciously trying to appear less threatening. When she reached the edge of the camp, he straightened up and nodded politely, the way one neighbor might greet another over a fence. "Ma'am," he said in English, his voice deep but soft. "My name is Daniel Mackenzie. I apologize for my appearance, but I wasn't expecting company." He gestured toward the fire, where a pot of something that smelled like venison stew was simmering over the coals. "Please, help yourself to whatever you need." Ayana approached the fire cautiously, ready to run, at the first sign of deception or threat. But Mackenzie made no move to get closer, instead returning to his work with the logs, as if her presence was perfectly ordinary. She knelt beside the pot and ladled some of the stew into a tin bowl that had been left nearby, apparently for exactly this purpose. The first spoonful of hot food was like a revelation, rich, perfectly seasoned venison, mixed with wild onions and herbs she couldn't identify, but that tasted like civilization itself. She forced herself to eat slowly, mindful that her empty stomach might rebel if she consumed too much too quickly. "The spring is just behind those rocks," Mackenzie said without looking up from his work. "Water's good and cold. I tested it myself when I first found this place." Ayana finished the stew and made her way to the spring, where she drank deeply. From water that was indeed clean and cold, tasting of minerals and mountain snow. When she returned to the fire, she found that Mackenzie had added another log to the cabin's walls and was now preparing his own meal. "Where are you traveling to?" he asked conversationally, as if they were old acquaintances catching up rather than strangers meeting in the wilderness. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Ayana wasn't ready to address. Her banishment was not something she could easily explain to a white man, especially one who might have connections to the authorities, who would be obligated to return her to the reservation. "I am between places," she said carefully in English, falling back on the diplomatic language she had learned during her time as a translator. "Looking for somewhere new to make a home." Mackenzie nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense. "This is good country for that," he said. "Plenty of water, good hunting, far enough from the settlements that a person can think without interruption. I'm planning to stay here myself if the land proves suitable." He gestured toward the partially completed cabin, building her slow and careful-like. "Want to make sure she'll stand up to whatever weather comes along. A home should last longer than the person who builds it." There was something in his tone that suggested deeper meaning, as if the cabin represented more than just shelter from the elements. Ayana found herself curious about this strange white man who spoke Apache, built with the patience of a craftsman, and showed no apparent concern about finding a pregnant Apache woman in his camp. As the stars appeared overhead and the fire settled into glowing coals, Mackenzie finished his meal and began banking the flames for the night. "There's blankets in that pack," he said, pointing to a canvas bundle near the cabin's foundation. "Nights get cold this time of year. You're welcome to sleep warm if you've a mind to." The offer was made without expectation or demand, simply a practical acknowledgement of physical necessity. Ayana had been prepared for many things when she approached this camp, but not for simple human kindness offered without condition or explanation. "Why?" she asked suddenly, the word escaping before she could stop it. Mackenzie looked up from the fire, his pale eyes reflecting the last of the flames. "Why what? Why do you help me? You don't know who I am or where I come from. I could be dangerous. I could bring trouble to your camp." He was quiet for a long moment, looking out toward the dark mountains that surrounded their valley. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of experience and hard-won wisdom. "Because," he said simply, "everybody deserves a chance to start over. And because sometimes the best thing you can do for a person is just let them know they're not alone in the world." The words hit Ayana like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were exactly what she needed to hear at the moment when she most needed to hear them. For the first time since her banishment, tears came freely, washing away days of fear and desperation in a flood of unexpected relief. Mackenzie made no comment about her tears, but his voice was even gentler when he spoke again. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we can talk about what comes next, if you've a mind to, but tonight you're safe." As Ayana wrapped herself in the offered blankets and lay down beside the dying fire, she felt the baby settle quietly in her womb, as if it too sensed that their desperate flight was over. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to hope that survival might be possible after all. Ayana woke before dawn to the sound of steady hammering echoing across the valley. The rhythmic strikes of metal on wood created a percussion that seemed to match her heartbeat as she emerged from the deepest sleep she had experienced in weeks. The blankets Mackenzie had provided were thick wool, military issue by their look, and they had kept her warm despite the desert's notorious temperature drops. She sat up carefully, one hand instinctively moving to her belly, where the baby was beginning to stir with gentle movements. The fire had been rebuilt while she slept, with fresh wood crackling cheerfully and a pot of coffee sending aromatic steam into the cool morning air. Mackenzie was nowhere to be seen, but the hammering continued from somewhere behind the cabins. Growing walls, moving stiffly from her night on hard ground, Ayana made her way around the structure to find Mackenzie working on what appeared to be window frames. He had somehow acquired glass panes, a luxury she hadn't expected to see in such a remote location, and was carefully fitting them into wooden frames he had crafted with obvious skill. "Morning," he said without looking up from his precise work. "Coffee's ready if you want some. There's biscuits in the Dutch oven, should still be warm." The casual normalcy of his greeting struck Ayana as both comforting and strange. She had lived her entire life in a world where every interaction between Apache and white people was charged with tension, suspicion, or outright hostility. Yet here was this man, treating her presence as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She poured herself coffee from the pot, savoring the rich flavor that spoke of quality beans rather than the chicory and burnt grain substitutes common on the reservation. The biscuits were indeed warm, light and fluffy in a way that suggested considerable baking skill. As she ate, she watched Mackenzie work, noting the methodical precision that characterized every movement. "You build like a man who plans to stay," she observed, switching to Apache to test his claimed fluency in her language. He looked up from the window frame, his pale blue eyes meeting hers directly. "I do plan to stay," he replied in the same language, his accent noticeable but his grammar correct. "This valley called to me the first time I saw it. Sometimes a place chooses a person as much as a person chooses a place." His Apache was better than she had initially realized, not just functional phrases, but genuine conversational ability. This raised new questions about his background and how he had come to learn her people's language so well. "Where did you learn to speak Apache?" she asked, returning to English. Mackenzie set down his hammer and reached for his own cup of coffee, taking a long sip before answering. "Spent some time with your people a few years back. Different band than yours, up in the White Mountains. They taught me that understanding someone's language is the first step to understanding their heart." There was something in his tone that suggested a deeper story, but Ayana sensed it was not one he was ready to share. Instead, she focused on the immediate mystery of his presence in this isolated valley. "This land," she said, gesturing around, "the valley, it belongs to no one or everyone, depending on how you see such things, but building a cabin makes it yours in the eyes of white law. Are you claiming it?" "I am," Mackenzie confirmed. "Filed the papers in Tucson last month. 160 acres under the Homestead Act, all legal and proper, though I don't expect to see another government man out here for years." The revelation that he had legally claimed the land added another layer to Ayana's situation. She was no longer simply accepting the hospitality of a fellow traveler, but trespassing on property that belonged to someone else according to territorial law. The distinction might matter greatly if authorities ever came looking for her. "Does my presence here cause you problems?" she asked directly, preparing herself for the possibility that she would need to move on again. Mackenzie considered the question with the same careful deliberation he brought to his construction work. "That depends," he said finally. "Are you running from something that might follow you here and cause trouble for both of us?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither of them had yet addressed directly. Ayana found herself at a crossroads between truth and self-preservation, knowing that her answer might determine whether she would be allowed to stay or forced to continue her desperate flight into the wilderness. "I was cast out from my people," she said, choosing honesty over comfort, "banished for bringing shame to the tribe. There may be those who would prefer I not survive to tell of their judgment." "What kind of shame brings banishment?" Mackenzie asked, though his tone suggested he might already suspect the answer. Ayana looked down at her hands, then placed them protectively over her swollen belly. "The kind that grows in a woman's womb when the father is the wrong color." Mackenzie nodded, as if this confirmed what he had already deduced. "Apache don't usually banish pregnant women regardless of the father. Must have been something more to it than just mixing bloodlines." His observation was perceptive enough to make Ayana wonder what other experiences he had with her people's customs. "The father was a soldier," she admitted, "an officer who came to negotiate treaties and left with promises he never kept. James." "Dalton," Mackenzie said quietly, the name dropping into their conversation like a stone into still water. Ayana's head snapped up in shock. "How do you know that name?" "Because Captain James Dalton was my brother-in-law," Mackenzie replied, his voice carrying layers of pain and anger that had been carefully controlled until this moment. "Married to my sister Rebecca, and because he's been dead for 3 months, shot by Apache raiders while traveling between posts." The world seemed to tilt around Ayana as the implications of this revelation crashed over her. The man who had offered her shelter and kindness was related by marriage to the father of her unborn child. More than that, he believed Dalton was dead, killed by her own people in exactly the kind of violence that made their love story impossible from the beginning. "Dead?" she whispered, the word feeling like broken glass in her mouth. "Ambushed on the road to Fort Bowie," Mackenzie continued, his eyes never leaving her face. "Rebecca's been a widow for 3 months now, crying herself to sleep every night over a husband she thought was faithful to her." The accusation in his voice was unmistakable, though not directed at her specifically. He was angry with Dalton, with the situation, with the cruel ironies that had brought them all to this point. Ayana felt her world reshaping itself around this new information, forcing her to reconsider everything she thought she knew about her relationship with the father of her child. "He never told me he was married," she said, the words coming out smaller than she intended. "He spoke of home, of family, but never of a wife." "James was good at not mentioning things that complicated his life," Mackenzie said bitterly. "Always was, even as a boy. Rebecca deserved better than a husband who made promises to Indian women while she waited for him to come home safe." The harsh judgment in his words stung, but Ayana could not argue with the essential truth behind them. She had been naive to believe that a white army officer could or would abandon his existing life for an Apache woman, regardless of the feelings they shared. The pregnancy that had seemed like a blessing had become proof of her own foolishness. "What will you do now?" she asked, uncertain whether she was asking about his intentions toward her or his plans for dealing with the knowledge of his brother-in-law's betrayal. Mackenzie was quiet for a long moment, staring out toward the mountains that surrounded their valley. When he spoke, his voice had lost its edge of anger and returned to the steady calm she had heard the night before. "What I'm going to do is finish building this cabin," he said. "What you're going to do is help me if you're willing and able. That child you're carrying is my bloodkin, whether James acknowledged it or not. Rebecca may never know about the baby, but I will, and I'll be damned if I let my nephew or niece come into the world without a roof overhead." The unexpected offer of partnership left Ayanna speechless. She had prepared herself for rejection, condemnation, or at best, grudging tolerance. Instead, Mackenzie was proposing something that seemed impossible, a family connection based not on love or marriage, but on shared responsibility for an unborn child. "You would do this for me?" she asked, "knowing what you know about how the child came to be." "I'm not doing it for you," Mackenzie replied, though not unkindly. "I'm doing it for the baby, and for Rebecca, who would want her husband's child. It cared for even if she could never acknowledge its existence, and maybe for James too, worthless as he turned out to be. Dead men don't get to make amends, but the living can sometimes do it for them." The practical arrangement he was proposing was unlike anything Ayanna had ever heard of. A partnership born of necessity and blood ties, rather than romance or traditional marriage. It offered her everything she desperately needed: shelter, protection, and help raising her child. But it also required her to trust a white man she barely knew, despite the complex emotions his revelation about Dalton had stirred up. "What would people say?" she asked. "A white man and an Apache woman living together, raising a mixed-blood child. The authorities might have opinions about such arrangements." "The nearest authorities are 2 days' ride from here," Mackenzie replied, "and I filed a claim to this land as a single man intending to homestead. What I do on my own property is my own business, as long as I don't break any territorial laws." He gestured toward the growing cabin with obvious pride. "This place is big enough for a family, isolated enough for privacy, and defendable enough to discourage casual visitors. We could make it work if we both wanted it to work." The baby kicked as if responding to the possibility of security and stability, and Ayanna placed both hands over the movement. For the first time since her banishment, she allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond mere survival. A home, work she could take pride in, and a child raised with the love of adults committed to its welfare. "What would you expect?" "From me," she asked, "in such an arrangement?" "Help with the building while you're able," Mackenzie said. "Cooking, mending, the kinds of work that keep a household running, knowledge of this country and how to live in it successfully, and honesty between us about what we both need to make this partnership work." The terms he outlined were practical rather than romantic. A business arrangement that acknowledged mutual benefit without pretending to emotions neither of them felt. It was not the future Ayanna had dreamed of during her secret meetings with Dalton, but it was infinitely better than dying alone in the desert. "And after the baby comes," she pressed, "what happens when there are 3 of us instead of 2? "Then we raise the child as well as we can," Mackenzie replied simply. "Teach it about both sides of its heritage. Prepare it for a world that won't make things easy because of its mixed blood. Give it the tools it needs to choose its own path when the time comes." The vision he painted was one of practical cooperation, rather than passionate love. But it offered something perhaps more valuable: security and acceptance for her child in a world that would otherwise see it as an unwelcome reminder of racial boundaries crossed. Over the following days, as Ayanna recovered her strength and began contributing to the cabin's construction, she discovered that Mackenzie was a man of many unexpected skills. He could cook elaborate meals over an open fire, sew torn clothing with stitches as neat as any woman's, and craft furniture from rough wood with tools he had obviously carried for years. More surprising was his knowledge of Apache customs and beliefs. When she performed the morning prayers her grandmother had taught her facing east to greet the sun, he respectfully gave her space and silence. When she gathered certain plants for teas that would help with her pregnancy, he asked intelligent questions about their properties and uses. "You know more about my people than most whites," she observed one afternoon as they worked together to chink gaps between the cabin's logs with clay and moss. "I lived among them for 8 months, Mackenzie replied, carefully pressing moss into a narrow crevice. "After my first wife died, I needed to get away from everything that reminded me of her. Went into the mountains to lose myself, ended up finding a different way of seeing the world." This was the first mention he had made of a previous wife, and Ayana found herself curious about the experiences that had shaped this unusual man. "What happened to her?" "Cholera," he said simply. "Swept through our town in Ohio like wildfire. She was dead 3 days after the first symptoms appeared. We'd only been married 2 years. The pain in his voice was old, but still real, explaining much about his current solitary existence and his apparent comfort with the idea of practical partnerships rather than romantic entanglements. Like her, he had lost someone important and been forced to rebuild his life from fragments. "Is that why you came west?" she asked. "Part of it. I also wanted land of my own, space to think, freedom to make my own decisions about how to live. The Apache taught me that a person can start over anywhere, as long as they're willing to learn new ways of seeing things." Their conversations during these working sessions revealed a man far more complex than his simple mountain man appearance suggested. He had been educated, had read extensively, and had thought deeply about the conflicts between Apache and white cultures that had shaped the territory's violent history. "Most whites see Apache as savages who need to be civilized or eliminated," he said one evening as they shared dinner by the fire. "Most Apache see whites as invaders who steal land and break promises. Both sides think they're fighting for survival, and both sides are right in their own way. But you see it differently," Ayana asked. "I see it as a waste," Mackenzie replied. "Two people who could learn from each other instead spend all their energy trying to destroy each other. Your child will grow up caught between those two worlds. But maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. Maybe it takes someone who belongs to both sides to help them find common ground." The idea that her mixed-blood child might serve as a bridge between cultures rather than a victim of their conflict was one Ayana had never considered. It offered a different way of thinking about the challenges her baby would face, transforming potential disadvantages into possible strengths. As the cabin neared completion and her pregnancy advanced into its final months, Ayana began to feel something she had not experienced since her banishment: hope for the future. The partnership with Mackenzie was working better than either of them had expected, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to practical goals rather than impossible romantic ideals. But she also knew that their isolated peace could not last indefinitely. Sooner or later, the outside world would intrude upon their carefully constructed sanctuary, bringing with it all the complications and conflicts they had temporarily escaped. When that happened, they would need more than good intentions and careful planning to protect the life they were building together. 2 weeks later, their fragile peace shattered like glass against stone when 3 Apache warriors appeared on the ridge overlooking their valley. Ayana spotted them first, their silhouettes unmistakable against the morning sky as they sat motionless on their horses, clearly conducting surveillance of the cabin below. She recognized one of them immediately, Swift Eagle, her cousin and one of the most respected young warriors in her former band. His presence meant this was not a random scouting party, but a deliberate mission with specific objectives. The tribal council had not simply banished her and forgotten about her existence. "We have visitors," she told Mackenzie quietly, finding him behind the cabin where he was splitting firewood for the coming winter. He followed her gaze to the ridge, his expression growing grim as he counted the mounted figures. "Friends of yours?" "Family," Ayana replied, the word carrying complications that a simple friend or enemy designation could not capture. "My cousin Swift Eagle and 2 others I don't recognize. They wouldn't come this far without orders from the council." Mackenzie set down his axe and walked to where his rifle leaned against the cabin wall, checking its load without making any threatening gestures toward the distant warriors. "What kind of orders might those be?" "To confirm I'm dead," Ayana said bluntly, "or to make sure I become dead if I'm not already." The warriors remained motionless for nearly an hour, clearly studying the layout of the valley, the construction of the cabin, and the activities of its inhabitants. When they finally moved, it was to descend the ridge at a deliberate pace that suggested confidence rather than stealth. Swift Eagle rode in front, his war paint and weapons marking him as someone prepared for violence if necessary. He was 25 years old, tall and lean, with the kind of controlled intensity that made him dangerous in battle. Behind him rode 2 older warriors she didn't immediately recognize, but their bearing suggested they held significant authority within the band. "They're coming down," Mackenzie observed unnecessarily. "You want to handle this, or shall I?" "We handle it together," Ayana replied, moving to stand beside him in front of the cabin. "But let me speak first. Apache protocol matters in situations like this." The 3 warriors approached to within 50 yards before halting, close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid immediate physical confrontation. Swift Eagle dismounted and walked forward alone, his hands visible but near his weapons. "Ayana Clearwater," he called out in Apache, his voice carrying across the distance with formal authority. "You were cast out from our people for bringing shame to the tribe. Yet here you live as the wife to a white man, building a house on stolen Apache land." "This land was never Apache territory," Ayana replied in the same language, her voice steady despite the fear pounding through her veins. "It belongs to the desert spirits, and they welcome all who treat it with respect. The white man beside you has claimed ownership through his government's papers," Swift Eagle continued. "He builds permanent structures that scar the earth and change the flow of natural water. Such actions are the beginning of towns, of settlements, of the white disease that destroys everything it touches." Mackenzie stepped forward slightly, addressing Swift Eagle in carefully pronounced Apache. "I claim only what I need to live, not what I desire to possess. The spring runs as it always has. The animals still drink here. The land remains as it was, except for one small place where 2 people seek to make a home." Swift Eagle's eyes widened slightly at hearing his language spoken by a white man, but his expression remained stern. "You speak our words, but do you understand their meaning? Home is not a thing built from cut trees and owned through papers. Home is the relationship between people and the land that sustains them. Then perhaps we understand each other better." "Than you think," Mackenzie replied. "I did not come here to possess this land, but to learn from it. Your cousin has been teaching me to see with Apache eyes as well as white ones." This was a diplomatic language of a sophistication that surprised even Ayana. Mackenzie was engaging with Apache concepts of land ownership and relationship in ways that suggested much deeper cultural understanding than she had realized he possessed. The 2 older warriors had also dismounted and were approaching their attention focused primarily on Ayana rather than the white man who spoke their language. She recognized them now. Red Hawk and Stone Wolf, both members of the tribal council and men whose opinions carried significant weight in all matters affecting the band's welfare. "Child of Morning Star," Red Hawk addressed her formally, using her mother's name to emphasize family connections that transcended her current disgrace. "The council sent us to learn what became of you after your banishment. We expected to find bones bleached by the sun and scattered by coyotes. Instead, We find you living as the woman of a white man, carrying his blood in your belly," Stonewolf added, his voice heavy with disapproval. "Was the shame you brought to our people insufficient? Must you compound it by taking another white man to your bed?" "The child I carry was fathered by Captain James Dalton of the United States Army," Ayanna replied clearly, ensuring all three warriors heard the name. "This man, Daniel Mackenzie, offers me shelter and protection because he is the brother of Dalton's white wife. He seeks to provide for his kinsman's child, not to claim me as his woman." The revelation that her current arrangement was based on family obligation rather than romantic attachment clearly surprised all three warriors. In Apache culture, such kinship responsibilities were taken seriously, even when they crossed racial boundaries. Swift Eagle looked between Ayanna and Mackenzie with new understanding. "You acknowledge the child as bloodkin, even though it comes from an Apache mother?" "The child carries my sister's husband's blood," Mackenzie replied firmly. "In my people's tradition, that makes the child family regardless of the mother's race. I will raise it with honor and teach it the ways of both its bloodlines." Red Hawk and Stonewolf exchanged glances that spoke of rapid recalculation of the situation they had expected to find. An Apache woman living in disgrace with a white lover was one thing. An Apache woman being protected by a white man fulfilling kinship obligations was quite another. "Show us this house you build," Stonewolf commanded, dismounting fully and approaching the cabin with obvious interest. What followed was an unexpected cultural exchange as Mackenzie guided the three warriors through the cabin, explaining his construction techniques and the purposes of various rooms and features. The Apache men were clearly impressed by the craftsmanship, particularly the way the building had been designed to work with the natural flow of water and wind, rather than fighting against them. "You build like someone who plans to become part of this place rather than its master," Red Hawk observed, running his hand along a carefully fitted log joint. "The Apache taught me that the land does not belong to people, but people can belong to the land if they approach it correctly," Mackenzie replied. "This cabin is my attempt to belong here without destroying what makes this place worth belonging to." The philosophical sophistication of his response clearly impressed all three warriors, who had come prepared to deal with a typical white settler's mentality of conquest and exploitation. Swift Eagle turned to Ayanna, his expression softer than it had been at the beginning of their encounter. "Cousin, the council believed your banishment would lead to your death within days. That you survived long enough to find protection speaks to your strength and the favor of the spirits." "What will you tell them when you return?" Ayanna asked, knowing that the warrior's report would determine whether she could continue to live in peace or would face renewed persecution. "We will tell them that Morningstar's daughter has found a way to survive her disgrace," Red Hawk replied, after consulting with his companions through meaningful glances. "That she lives under the protection of a white man who acknowledges kinship, obligations and shows respect for Apache ways. And we will tell them," Stonewolf added, "that the child she carries will be raised with knowledge of both bloodlines, which may prove valuable in the difficult years ahead when our people must learn new ways of dealing with the white world." The implicit message was clear. Ayanna's survival and her unusual living arrangement might be seen as an asset rather than a continued source of shame, particularly if her child could serve as a bridge between cultures in future negotiations. As the three warriors prepared to leave, Swift Eagle approached Ayanna privately, speaking in low tones meant for her ears alone. "The white man treats you well?" he asked in Apache. "With respect and fairness," she replied honestly. "He asks nothing of me except honest work and partnership in building a home for the child." "And your heart? Does it heal from the soldiers?" "Betrayal." Ayanna considered the question carefully before answering. "My heart learns to value different things than it once did." Security for my child matters more than passion. Respect matters more than romantic promises. Swift Eagle nodded, approvingly. That is the wisdom of a woman who has survived great hardship. Keep that wisdom, cousin. The world ahead will require it. After the Apache delegation departed, Ayanna and Mackenzie returned to their daily routines with a sense of relief mixed with new responsibilities. The tribal council's implicit acceptance of their arrangement provided a level of legitimacy they had not expected. But it also meant they were now visible to the outside world in ways that could bring unwanted attention. They seemed satisfied with our explanations, Mackenzie observed, as they watched the three riders disappear over the northern ridge. For now, Ayanna agreed, but acceptance from my people doesn't guarantee acceptance from yours. If territorial authorities learn about our arrangement, they may have different opinions about a white man cohabitating with an Apache woman and claiming to raise a mixed-blood child. The warning proved prophetic 3 days later when a different group of riders appeared on the horizon, these coming from the south and flying the colors of the United States Army. The cavalry patrol consisted of 8 soldiers led by a lieutenant, who carried himself with the rigid posture of a West Point graduate. They approached the valley methodically, their formation precise, and their weapons prominently displayed in a show of military authority that left no doubt about their intentions. Lieutenant William Hayes dismounted 30 yards from the cabin, his pale eyes scanning the scene with calculated assessment. He was young, perhaps 25, with the kind of clean-shaven appearance that marked him as someone still trying to prove himself worthy of his commission. "Daniel Mackenzie," he called out, consulting a folded paper he withdrew from his jacket pocket. "You are hereby ordered to appear before Colonel Marcus Thompson at Fort Apache for questioning regarding harboring fugitive Apache individuals in violation of territorial statutes." Mackenzie stepped forward calmly, his hands visible but positioned, where he could reach his weapons if necessary. "Lieutenant Hayes, I presume I've heard about your reputation for thorough investigations." The familiarity in Mackenzie's tone clearly surprised the young officer, who had expected to be dealing with an isolated homesteader rather than someone who knew his name and reputation. "You know who I am?" Word travels fast in this territory. When a new officer starts making aggressive moves against settlers, Mackenzie replied evenly, especially when those moves seem designed more to advance a career than solve actual problems. Hayes's face reddened at the implied criticism, but he maintained his official composure. "My orders come directly from Colonel Thompson, who has received reports of illegal cohabitation between white settlers and Apache fugitives. Such arrangements violate both territorial law and military regulations governing interaction with hostile tribes. The Apache woman in my household is not a fugitive," Mackenzie stated clearly. "She was legally banished from her tribe, making her a free individual under both Apache law and territorial statute. My arrangement with her is a private matter involving family obligations." "Family obligations?" Hayes laughed harshly. "You expect me to believe that an Apache squaw has legitimate family connections to a white homesteader?" The crude language and dismissive tone triggered something dangerous in Mackenzie's expression, a shift from diplomatic courtesy to barely controlled violence. "Lieutenant, I'll give you one opportunity to rephrase that statement with the respect due to a lady." Hayes's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, but the 7 soldiers behind him remained motionless, clearly uncomfortable with their officer's confrontational approach. These were frontier veterans who had learned to distinguish between necessary conflicts and pointless provocations. From inside the cabin, Ayanna emerged carrying a tin cup and a plate of biscuits, moving with the serene dignity that Apache women used to demonstrate their refusal to be intimidated by hostile men. She approached the group slowly, offering refreshments with traditional hospitality that transformed the confrontation into something resembling a social visit. "Lieutenant," she said in perfectly clear English, "you and your men have ridden far in the heat. Please accept water and food as our guests." The gesture was both culturally appropriate and tactically brilliant, forcing Hayes to either accept hospitality or reveal himself as someone who rejected basic frontier courtesy. His soldiers were already eyeing the offered refreshments with obvious interest after their long ride. "I am not here as your guest," Hayes replied stiffly, though he made no move to prevent his men from accepting water. "I am here on official military business, investigating reports of illegal arrangements between white settlers and Apache fugitives." "Then investigate," Ayana replied calmly. "Ask your questions, examine our home, satisfy yourself that we are law-abiding people living peacefully on legally claimed land." Her straightforward response clearly disarmed Hayes, who had prepared for defiance or deception rather than complete cooperation. He spent the next hour conducting a thorough inspection of the cabin and its surroundings, looking for evidence of illegal activities or violations of territorial statutes. What he found instead was a well-constructed homestead being developed, according to proper legal procedures, with documentation proving Mackenzie's legitimate claim to the land and his compliance with homesteading requirements. The partnership between the white man and Apache woman was clearly one of practical cooperation, rather than the illicit relationship he had expected to discover. "Your documentation appears to be in order," Hayes admitted reluctantly as he reviewed Mackenzie's homestead papers. "But the nature of your relationship with this Apache woman remains questionable under territorial guidelines governing interaction with potentially hostile tribal members." "The woman is Ayana Clearwater, formerly of the San Carlos Band," Mackenzie replied formally. "She was legally banished by her tribal council for conduct they deemed inappropriate. Under both Apache law and territorial statute, this banishment makes her a free individual with the right to seek employment and shelter where she chooses." "Employment?" Hayes seized on the word as if it offered a new avenue of attack. "You claim she works for you rather than living as your woman?" "She works with me as a partner in developing this homestead," Mackenzie corrected. "Our arrangement is based on practical necessity and family obligations rather than romantic attachment." Hayes looked skeptical. What family obligations could possibly exist between a white homesteader and a banished Apache woman? Mackenzie exchanged glances with Ayana before answering, clearly weighing how much truth to reveal to hostile authority. "The child she carries was fathered by my late brother-in-law, Captain James Dalton. I consider it my responsibility to ensure the welfare of my sister's husband's offspring, regardless of the mother's race." The revelation struck Hayes like a physical blow, his face going pale as the implications registered. Captain James Dalton had been a respected officer whose death had been officially attributed to Apache raiders. The suggestion that he had been involved with an Apache woman complicated that narrative significantly. "You're claiming that Captain Dalton had relations with this Apache woman?" Hayes asked, his voice carefully controlled. "I'm stating that the child she carries is his," Mackenzie replied bluntly. "Whether you choose to investigate that claim or ignore it for the sake of military reputation is your decision." The soldiers behind Hayes were now listening with obvious interest, clearly aware of the potential scandal such revelations could create if they became public knowledge. Military careers had been destroyed by less inflammatory information. Sergeant Murphy, a grizzled veteran who clearly had more frontier experience than his young lieutenant, stepped forward diplomatically. "Sir, perhaps we should return to the fort and report our findings to Colonel Thompson. The situation here appears to be more complex than our initial intelligence suggested." Hayes nodded curtly, recognizing that he was dealing with complications. beyond his authority to resolve. This matter will require consultation with higher authorities. You will remain available for further questioning as needed." "We're not going anywhere," Mackenzie replied. "This is our home, and we intend to continue living here peacefully unless someone provides legal grounds for forcing us to leave." After the patrol departed, Ayanna and Mackenzie returned to their daily routines with the knowledge that their arrangement was now under official scrutiny. The military's interest in their situation meant that other complications were likely to follow, particularly if word reached Rebecca Dalton about her husband's Apache relationship. "They'll be back," Ayanna observed, as they watched the soldiers disappear toward the southern horizon. Men like Lieutenant Hayes don't accept defeat gracefully, especially when their authority has been challenged in front of their subordinates. "Let them come," Mackenzie replied grimly. "We've broken no laws and harmed no one. If they want to make trouble for us, they'll have to manufacture grounds for it." The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly vigorous kick, as if responding to the tension in its mother's voice. Ayanna placed both hands over the movement, her expression softening with maternal concern. "Perhaps we should consider leaving," she suggested, "finding somewhere more remote where official attention is less likely to follow us." "Running would only confirm their suspicions that we're hiding something illegal," Mackenzie replied. "Besides, this land is ours now. We've invested too much work and hope in this place to abandon it without a fight." 2 days later, their resolve was tested when a civilian rider appeared carrying mail and news from the territorial capital. The man was a professional courier who made regular runs between remote settlements, and his arrival usually meant important communications from the outside world. "Letter for Daniel Mackenzie," the courier announced, handing over an envelope bearing official military seals. "Came through Fort Apache with urgent priority marking." The letter proved to be from Colonel Thompson himself, written in the formal language of military correspondence, but carrying undertones of personal interest that suggested deeper complications than routine administrative inquiry. "Mr. Mackenzie," the letter began, "recent investigations have brought to my attention circumstances requiring clarification regarding the death of Captain James Dalton and subsequent developments affecting his family. Your cooperation in providing detailed information about these matters would be appreciated and could prove beneficial to all parties involved." The carefully neutral language could not disguise what amounted to an invitation to negotiate rather than a demand for submission. Colonel Thompson was apparently more interested in containing potential scandal than pursuing aggressive prosecution of questionable activities. "He wants to make a deal," Ayanna observed after reading the letter over Mackenzie's shoulder, probably hoping to keep information about Dalton's Apache relationship from reaching his widow or becoming public knowledge. "That works in our favor," Mackenzie agreed. "Official silence about embarrassing military scandals is worth considerable accommodation regarding our living arrangements." The strategic implications of their situation were becoming clearer. They possessed information that could damage military reputations and cause personal pain to innocent parties, while the military possessed authority that could disrupt their peaceful existence. Finding mutually beneficial accommodation seemed preferable to prolonged conflict for all involved. But as Ayanna felt another strong kick from her unborn child, she wondered whether such careful negotiations would prove sufficient to protect the family they were building together in this isolated valley. Colonel Thompson's meeting took place not at Fort Apache as expected, but at a neutral location 20 miles south of their valley. The venue was a trading post owned by Marcus Brennan, an Irish immigrant who had built his reputation on maintaining strict neutrality in conflicts between military, civilian, and Apache interests. His establishment served as an unofficial diplomatic ground where sensitive negotiations could occur away from the rigid protocols of military installations. Mackenzie and Ayanna arrived to find Thompson already waiting with a small civilian escort rather than the military contingent they had anticipated. The colonel was older than his correspondence had suggested, perhaps 55, with grey threading through his dark hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent in frontier postings. His uniform was immaculate but practical, designed for function rather than parade ground display. "Mr. Mackenzie, Miss Clearwater," he greeted them formally but without hostility. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I believe we can resolve our mutual concerns more effectively through direct conversation than through continued official investigations." Thompson's immediate recognition of Ayanna as an individual worthy of formal address, rather than dismissing her as merely Mackenzie's property, established a tone of respect that neither had expected from military authority. It suggested careful consideration of their situation, rather than predetermined judgment. "Colonel," Mackenzie replied cautiously, "we appreciate the opportunity for dialogue, though I confess uncertainty about what mutual concerns you're referring to." "The concerns center around Captain James Dalton's death and the circumstances preceding it," Thompson said bluntly. "Recent information suggests that the official report may have omitted significant details about his activities and associations prior to the Apache raid that killed him." Ayanna felt the baby stir restlessly as tension flooded her system, but she maintained her composed exterior while processing the implications of Thompson's statement. The colonel was clearly aware of Dalton's relationship with her and was seeking to understand how that information affected the military's official narrative. "What kind of details?" she asked directly, her voice steady despite the emotional minefield they were entering. Thompson studied her face carefully before answering. "Details suggest that Captain Dalton's presence on the road where he died was not random military business but a personal journey to meet someone whose identity could significantly complicate the official version of his death." The revelation that Thompson knew about Dalton's planned meeting with her struck Ayanna like a physical blow. She had assumed their relationship was secret, known only to the two of them, and perhaps a few trusted intermediaries. The discovery that military intelligence had been tracking Dalton's movements suggested surveillance she had never suspected. "Captain Dalton was traveling to meet you, wasn't he, Miss Clearwater?" Thompson continued gently. "He had received word of your pregnancy and was attempting to reach you when the Apache raiders intercepted him." Mackenzie's hand moved protectively toward Ayanna's elbow, offering silent support as she struggled to process this new information. The possibility that Dalton had died trying to reach her transformed her understanding of his absence from abandonment to tragedy. "How do you know this?" she whispered, the words barely audible in the trading post's dim interior. "Because I was the one who gave him permission to make the journey," Thompson replied, his voice heavy with old regret. "James came to me with a story about an Apache woman carrying his child, asking for leave to arrange for her protection and the child's welfare. I thought he was being honorable, trying to take responsibility for his actions." The colonel's admission revealed layers of complexity that none of them had previously understood. Dalton's relationship with Ayanna had not been entirely secret, and his death had not been the result of random violence, but a targeted attack on someone whose movements were being monitored by hostile forces. "If you gave him permission, why wasn't this included in the official report?" Mackenzie asked, clearly working through the political implications of Thompson's revelation. "Because including it would have destroyed two families instead of one," Thompson replied firmly. "James's wife Rebecca knew nothing of his Apache relationship. Revealing it would have added personal devastation to her grief without serving any constructive purpose." Ayanna understood the logic, but felt the injustice of being erased from Dalton's story to protect his white wife's feelings. her own grief. And loss had been deemed less important than maintaining comfortable illusions for someone who had never known she existed. "What about my child?" she asked, placing both hands protectively over her belly. "Doesn't the baby deserve to know the truth about its father's death?" "That's part of why we're having this conversation," Thompson said, reaching into his jacket to withdraw a leather portfolio. "James left detailed instructions about what would happen if he died before resolving your situation. He wanted his child provided for, regardless of the mother's race or the complications such provision might create." The portfolio contained documents that took Ayana's breath away. A will amendment acknowledging the child she carried and establishing a trust fund for its education and support. A letter addressed to her personally, explaining his feelings and his intentions. Most surprising, a formal request that his brother-in-law Daniel Mackenzie be appointed as the child's guardian if anything happened to prevent Dalton from fulfilling his own responsibilities. "He knew about your connection to Mackenzie," Ayana asked, looking between the two men with new understanding. "I told him," Mackenzie admitted quietly. "When he first mentioned his Apache relationship, I recognized the description of you from stories my sister Rebecca had shared about his work at the reservation. I thought he should know that his child would have a family willing to help if needed. The revelation that all three men had been coordinating behind the scenes to ensure her welfare and her child's future left Ayana momentarily speechless. The abandonment she had felt during the months of silence had been replaced by complex negotiations and legal arrangements she had never suspected. Thompson spread the documents across the trading post's scarred wooden table, explaining their legal significance and the mechanisms Dalton had established to provide for his unborn child. The trust fund was substantial, enough to ensure education and opportunities that would otherwise be impossible for a mixed-blood child in territorial society. "The challenge," Thompson continued, "is implementing these provisions without creating scandal that could harm innocent parties or compromise military effectiveness. Rebecca Dalton remains unaware of her husband's Apache relationship, and there are political considerations regarding public perception of military officers' conduct. You want us to stay quiet about James's relationship with Ayana in exchange for access to the trust fund," Mackenzie summarized, cutting through diplomatic language to identify the essential bargain being offered. "I want to find a solution that serves everyone's legitimate interests," Thompson corrected. "The child deserves its father's provision. You deserve to raise that child without harassment from military or civilian authorities. And Rebecca deserves to remember her husband with honor rather than shame." Ayana studied the legal documents with growing amazement at their thoroughness and generosity. Dalton had anticipated numerous contingencies and provided detailed instructions for ensuring his child's welfare under various circumstances. The man she had thought abandoned her had actually been planning for their family's future until the moment of his death. "What about the Apache raiders who killed him?" she asked, focusing on the aspect of the situation that remained unexplained. Were they really random attackers, or was there something more deliberate about the timing and location? Thompson's expression grew darker, and he exchanged glances with Brennan before answering. "That's where the situation becomes more complicated. The raiders were not from your former band or any of the recognized Apache groups in this region. They appeared to be mixed-blood individuals with connections to elements within the territorial government. The implication was staggering. Dalton's death might not have been the result of general Apache-white conflict, but a specific assassination designed to prevent him from reaching Ayana and legitimizing their relationship. The trust fund and legal provisions he had established suggested someone had viewed their union as threatening enough to warrant murder. Who would want to prevent a military officer from acknowledging a mixed-blood child? Mackenzie asked, though his tone suggested he was already forming theories about possible motives. People who profit from maintaining strict racial boundaries, Thompson replied grimly. There are individuals within the territorial government who have built careers and fortunes on the premise that whites and Apaches can never coexist peacefully. A respected military officer publicly acknowledging an Apache family would undermine that narrative significantly. Brennan, who had been quietly listening to the conversation while maintaining his trading post's neutrality, finally spoke up. There's been talk among the traders about government men paying bounties for information on mixed relationships and mixed-blood children. Nothing official, but money changing hands for reports on who's crossing racial lines. The suggestion that there was organized surveillance and potential targeting of mixed-race relationships added a sinister dimension to their situation. They were not simply dealing with social prejudice or military regulations, but with active conspiracy to prevent racial integration through violence and intimidation. "Are we in danger?" Ayanna asked directly, needing to understand the level of threat they faced as they planned for their child's future. "Possibly," Thompson admitted with obvious reluctance. "Your arrangement with Mackenzie provides some protection because it appears to be based on family obligation rather than romantic attachment. But the child's legitimacy and the trust fund James established could make you targets for people who profit from maintaining racial separation." The meeting continued for 2 more hours as they worked through the practical details of implementing Dalton's provisions while maintaining the discretion necessary to protect all parties involved. The legal mechanisms were complex but achievable, requiring careful coordination between military, civilian, and territorial authorities. Most importantly, they established communication protocols that would allow Thompson to provide early warning if intelligence suggested increasing danger to the household. The colonel's network of informants throughout the territory could serve as an early warning system for organized threats against mixed families. As they prepared to leave the trading post, Thompson made one final request that surprised them both. "I'd like to visit your homestead in a few months after the child is born. James was like a son to me, and I want to meet his child properly." The personal dimension of his request revealed the emotional investment he had in ensuring Dalton's family legacy survived despite the complications surrounding it. This was not simply military duty or political calculation, but genuine care for people he had come to respect. The ride back to their valley was quiet, both Ayanna and Mackenzie processing the revelations and implications of their meeting with Thompson. The knowledge that Dalton had died trying to reach them rather than abandoning them provided emotional closure, but raised new fears about organized threats to mixed families. "Do you think we can trust him?" Ayanna asked as their cabin came into view, looking more precious and vulnerable than ever in light of their new understanding of the dangers surrounding them. "I think we don't have much choice," Mackenzie replied honestly. "Thompson holds all the official power, but we hold information that could embarrass the military and the territorial government. As long as that balance exists, cooperation serves everyone's interests better than conflict." 2 weeks after their meeting with Thompson, Ayanna went into labor during a thunderstorm that turned their peaceful valley into a landscape of lightning and driving rain. The timing seemed symbolic, as if the child was determined to enter the world during nature's own dramatic display of power and change. Mackenzie proved surprisingly skilled as a midwife, having assisted with births during his time living with the Apache bands in the White Mountains. His calm competence during the difficult labor helped Ayanna through the most challenging hours of her life. When their daughter finally arrived just before dawn, she announced her presence with a cry that seemed to echo across the entire valley. Despite the continuing storm, She was perfect in every detail, with her father's strong features and her mother's dark eyes, a living bridge between two worlds that had too often seen each other only as enemies. "What will you name her?" Mackenzie asked as Ayana held the baby close, both of them exhausted but filled with wonder at the new life they had brought safely into the world. "Grace," Ayana replied without hesitation. "Grace Dalton Clearwater. She carries all our names and all our hopes." As the storm passed and sunlight began filtering through the cabin's windows, illuminating the face of the sleeping infant, both adults felt the profound responsibility of protecting this child's future in a world that would challenge her existence simply because of the mixed blood flowing through her veins. But they also felt hope, knowing that she represented something new and precious, living proof that love could transcend the boundaries others sought to enforce, and that families could be built on choice and commitment rather than simply blood and tradition. Grace was 3 months old when the first attempt on their lives came without warning on a crisp October morning. Ayana was hanging laundry behind the cabin while Mackenzie worked on expanding their root cellar when movement on the eastern ridge caught her attention. 3 men on horseback, but these were not Apache warriors or military personnel. Their clothing and equipment marked them as civilian contractors, the kind of men who took payment for jobs that official authorities preferred not to handle directly. The baby was sleeping peacefully in a wooden cradle Mackenzie had crafted with intricate Apache designs carved into its sides, positioned where Ayana could watch her while working. The sight of armed strangers approaching their isolated homestead triggered every maternal instinct she possessed, flooding her system with adrenaline that made her hyper-aware of every detail. "Daniel!" she called softly, not wanting to wake Grace, but needing to alert him to the potential threat. He appeared around the corner of the cabin within seconds, his rifle already in his hands, and his expression grim as he spotted the approaching riders. "Get the baby inside," he said quietly. "Use the back window if you need to leave quickly." But as the 3 men descended into the valley, it became clear that escape was not an option. 2 more riders appeared on the western ridge, positioning themselves to cut off retreat routes while maintaining clear fields of fire toward the cabin. This was not a random encounter, but a coordinated assault by professionals who had studied their target carefully. The leader of the group was a man Ayana recognized with cold dread, Marcus Webb, a territorial agent whose reputation for ruthless efficiency in handling Indian problems was whispered about in trading posts throughout Arizona. He was perhaps 40 years old, lean and weathered, with the kind of pale eyes that suggested he enjoyed his work more than decent men should. "Daniel." "Mackenzie," Webb called out as his group approached to within 50 yards of the cabin. "By order of Territorial Administrator Harrison Blackwood, you are commanded to surrender the Apache woman and mixed-blood child for relocation to appropriate reservation facilities." The name Blackwood sent chills through both adults. Harrison. Blackwood was known throughout the territory as a man who had built his political career on promises to solve the Apache problem through whatever means proved necessary. If he had issued orders regarding their family, it meant their situation had attracted attention at the highest levels of territorial government. "I see no legal documentation authorizing such orders," Mackenzie replied calmly, though his grip on the rifle had tightened noticeably. "This is private property, legally claimed and properly registered. You have no authority here." Webb's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Legal documentation becomes irrelevant when dealing with threats to territorial security. The woman is a fugitive from reservation authority, and the child represents a violation of racial separation policies essential to maintaining peace between whites and Indians." The bureaucratic language could not disguise what amounted to a kidnapping attempt backed by territorial authority. Webb and his men intended to take Grace away from her parents, probably to one of the boarding schools where mixed-blood children were systematically stripped of their cultural heritage and trained to serve white society in menial capacities. "The child is an American citizen," Ayanna said clearly, emerging from the cabin with Grace in her arms. "Born on American soil to an American father. No territorial administrator has authority to relocate American citizens against their will." Webb's expression grew more predatory as he studied the baby in her arms. "Half-breed spawn has no citizenship rights. The territorial court has ruled that mixed-blood children follow the legal status of their mother, making them subject to reservation authority regardless of paternity." The legal maneuvering was sophisticated enough to suggest careful preparation, but Ayanna had spent enough time with military officers to understand the weaknesses in their position. The child's father was Captain James Dalton of the United States Army. His paternity is documented through military channels and supported by Colonel Thompson at Fort Apache. The mention of Thompson's name caused visible consternation among Webb's men, who had clearly not expected to encounter military complications in what they assumed would be a simple enforcement action against isolated homesteaders. "Colonel Thompson has no authority over territorial Indian policy," Webb replied, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Administrator Blackwood's orders supersede military preferences regarding mixed-race relationships." Mackenzie stepped closer to Ayanna, creating a protective barrier between the armed men and his family. "Then Administrator Blackwood can explain his legal reasoning to federal authorities when they investigate the kidnapping of a military officer's child." The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with both sides calculating their options. While maintaining the pretense of civilized negotiation, Webb's men were clearly professionals, but they were also outnumbered by the implications of their mission if it went wrong and attracted federal attention. Finally, Webb seemed to reach a decision that satisfied his need for face-saving retreat while avoiding direct confrontation with military authority. "This matter will be resolved through proper channels," he announced. "But the child's mixed status remains a concern for territorial security. Further investigation will be conducted." As the 5 men rode away, Ayanna felt no relief despite their temporary victory. Webb was not the type to give up easily, and Blackwood's involvement suggested coordinated pressure that would only intensify with time. "They'll be back," she said, clutching Grace protectively while watching the riders disappear over the ridge. "Not if we get to them first," Mackenzie replied grimly. That evening, by firelight that cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls, they developed a plan that was both audacious and necessary. Rather than waiting for their enemies to choose the time and place of the next confrontation, they would take the offensive by gathering evidence of the conspiracy against mixed families and presenting it to federal authorities who outranked territorial administrators. "Thompson mentioned that there are other mixed families being targeted," Ayanna pointed out. "If we can document a pattern of illegal harassment and kidnapping attempts, federal prosecutors might be willing to investigate Blackwood's entire operation." The plan required leaving their secure valley and traveling to potentially dangerous locations where other mixed families had reportedly been attacked. But the alternative was remaining passive targets while their enemies grew stronger and more coordinated. Mackenzie had contacts throughout the territory from his years of wilderness trading, including several mixed-race families who had chosen isolation over reservation life. Many of these families had children who would face the same threats as Grace if Blackwood's policies continued expanding. Over the following weeks, they began a careful campaign of investigation and documentation. Using the baby's need for regular feeding and care as cover, they traveled in a pattern that appeared random but actually connected isolated homesteads where mixed families lived in constant fear of official persecution. What they discovered was far more extensive than either had imagined. Blackwood's men had been systematically targeting mixed families throughout the territory, using bureaucratic authority to justify what amounted to organized terrorism. Children had been seized and sent to distant boarding schools. Parents had been arrested on fabricated charges, and property had been confiscated under various pretexts. The most disturbing discovery came from a trading post near the Gila River, where they met Sarah Morningside, a mixed-blood woman whose Apache mother and Scottish father had raised her to navigate both cultures successfully. Sarah had been married to a white homesteader until Blackwood's men killed her husband and took her 2 children to a boarding school in Colorado. "They came at dawn," Sarah told them, her voice hollow with grief that was still fresh despite occurring 6 months earlier. "Said my marriage to a white man was illegal because Apache women couldn't legally consent to such unions. Shot Thomas when he tried to protect the children, then told me I should be grateful they were sending the little ones to school instead of prison." The brutality of Sarah's story was multiplied by dozens of similar accounts they gathered from other survivors. Blackwood's campaign against mixed families was not bureaucratic harassment, but systematic destruction of people whose very existence challenged his political narrative about racial separation. But gathering evidence also meant exposing themselves to increasing danger. Word of their activities reached unfriendly ears, and by November they were being tracked by multiple groups of men who seemed to appear wherever their investigations led them. The crisis came to a head when they stopped at a remote trading post to meet with a family who had promised crucial documentation of Blackwood's illegal activities. The family never appeared, and as darkness fell, they realized they had been led into a trap. Marcus Webb emerged from the trading post's back room with 6 armed men, all of them bearing the confident expressions of hunters who had finally cornered their prey. The trading post owner, whom they had trusted as neutral, clearly had been bought or intimidated into cooperation with Blackwood's forces. "This time there will be no legal discussions," Webb announced, his hand resting casually on his revolver. A grip. "Administrator Blackwood has grown tired of your interference with territorial policy. The half-breed child will be relocated to appropriate educational facilities, and you 2 will be charged with inciting Indian unrest and violating territorial statutes regarding racial mixing." Grace was sleeping peacefully in Ayana's arms, unaware that her existence had become the center of a political struggle that could determine the future of mixed families throughout the territory. The bureaucratic language Webb used could not disguise the fact that they intended to destroy her family and use her as a political symbol. "The child goes nowhere without her parents," Ayana said firmly, her voice carrying the kind of maternal authority that transcended race or politics. "The child goes where territorial authority decides," Webb replied, "and the parents go where territorial courts send them after proper legal proceedings." Mackenzie had been quietly assessing their tactical situation while Webb delivered his ultimatums, noting the positions of the armed men and identifying potential escape routes. The trading post's layout offered few advantages, but desperation could sometimes create opportunities that careful planning missed. "Before you execute Blackwood's orders," Mackenzie said calmly, "you might want to consider the federal warrant that was issued yesterday for his arrest on charges of conspiracy to violate civil rights under federal protection." The statement was a complete fabrication, but it was delivered with such conviction that several of Webb's men exchanged uncertain glances. Federal authorities did occasionally intervene in territorial affairs when local officials exceeded their authority too dramatically. "You're lying," Webb said, but his voice carried less certainty than before. "Colonel Thompson received confirmation yesterday through military channels," Mackenzie continued, elaborating on his deception with details that made it sound credible. Blackwood's activities have attracted attention from Justice Department investigators who specialize in violations of federal civil rights statutes. The mention of Justice Department involvement was particularly effective because it represented authority that even territorial administrators could not ignore or intimidate. Webb's confidence was clearly shaking as he considered the possibility that his mission had been compromised by federal intervention. At that moment of uncertainty, when Webb's attention was focused on evaluating Mackenzie's claims, Ayanna made a decision that changed everything. She began singing an Apache lullaby in a voice that carried clearly through the trading post's tense atmosphere. The song was one her grandmother had taught her, calling upon the spirits of ancestors to protect children from harm. But it also served as a signal that every Apache within miles would recognize as a call for assistance from a woman whose child was threatened. Webb recognized the potential implications immediately. "Stop that noise," he ordered, his hand moving toward his weapon, but the damage was already done. In the distance, barely audible over the wind, came an answering song from the darkness beyond the trading post. Then another, from a different direction. Within minutes, the night was alive with Apache voices responding to Ayanna's call for help. "Congratulations," Mackenzie told Webb with grim satisfaction. "You've just learned the difference between threatening an isolated family and threatening an Apache mother whose people are within hearing distance." The tactical situation had reversed completely. Webb's 6 men were now potentially facing dozens of Apache warriors who had responded to a traditional call for protection of threatened children. The trading post that had seemed like a secure trap was now surrounded by hostile forces whose numbers and positions were unknown. "This isn't over," Webb snarled, but he was already signaling his men to prepare for withdrawal rather than confrontation with superior forces. As Webb's group retreated into the darkness, Apache warriors began appearing around the trading post. Swift Eagle was among them, along with several other men Ayanna recognized from her former band. They had come in response to her call, setting aside the complications of her banishment to answer the ancient obligation of protecting Apache children from harm. "Cousin," Swift Eagle said formally, approaching with weapons ready but not immediately threatening. "We heard your call and came as tradition demands. Are you and your child safe?" The formal recognition of her right to call for assistance despite her banishment was deeply significant, suggesting that her mixed-blood child was being accepted as worthy of tribal protection regardless of the circumstances surrounding its conception. "We are safe now," Ayanna replied gratefully, "but the danger has not ended. The territorial administrators will not accept this intervention lightly." "Then perhaps it is time for the territorial administrators to learn that Apache mothers and their children are not defenseless," Swift Eagle replied, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that had made him feared in battle. The confrontation at the trading post marked a turning point in their struggle against Blackwood's persecution. What had begun as a private family matter had evolved into a broader conflict over the rights of mixed families and the limits of territorial authority over people who claimed protection under both Apache tradition and American law. The federal investigation that followed moved with surprising speed once Colonel Thompson presented the documented evidence to his contacts in Washington. Within 2 weeks of the trading post confrontation, Justice Department investigators arrived in Arizona Territory carrying warrants that sent shockwaves through Blackwood's entire organization. Ayanna watched from the cabin's front porch as a dust cloud on the southern horizon marked the approach of an official convoy that included not only federal marshals, but also newspaper correspondents from eastern cities. The story of systematic persecution against mixed families had captured national attention, particularly when details emerged about murdered homesteaders and kidnapped children. Grace gurgled contentedly in her mother's arms, now 4 months old. and blissfully unaware that her existence had helped expose a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. The baby had grown stronger and more alert, her dark eyes following movement with obvious intelligence, while her mixed heritage became more apparent in features that combined both parents' bloodlines. Marshal William Crawford, the lead federal investigator, was a man whose reputation for thoroughness had made him legendary among frontier law enforcement. He was perhaps 50 years old, with steel-grey hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent tracking criminals through every type of terrain the American West could offer. "Mrs. Clearwater, Mr. Mackenzie," Crawford greeted them formally as he dismounted near their cabin. "I want to thank you personally for the courage you've shown in bringing this conspiracy to light. Without your documentation and testimony, Harrison Blackwood might have continued his illegal activities indefinitely." The Marshal's immediate recognition of Ayanna as an individual worthy of formal address, rather than dismissing her as Mackenzie's property, established the respectful tone that would characterize all their subsequent interactions with federal authorities. "What's the current status of the investigation?" Mackenzie asked, inviting Crawford and his associates to sit in the chairs he had crafted for their front porch. "Blackwood was arrested yesterday morning in Tucson on federal charges of conspiracy to violate civil rights, corruption in office, and ordering the murders of at least 12 territorial citizens," Crawford replied. "Marcus Webb and most of his men are already in federal custody, and we're tracking down the remaining members of their organization." The news that their primary persecutors were finally facing justice provided enormous relief. But Ayanna understood that legal proceedings could take months or years to complete. What about the children who were taken to boarding schools? Will they be returned to their families? "That's more complicated," Crawford admitted. "Some of the children have been at the schools for months and have formed attachments to staff and other students. We're working with family advocates to determine what's genuinely in each child's best interest, rather than simply reversing all of Blackwood's actions without considering individual circumstances." The thoughtful approach to reuniting families demonstrated the kind of careful consideration that had been absent from Blackwood's brutal policies. Federal authorities were apparently committed to healing the damage rather than simply punishing the perpetrators. Sarah Morningside arrived that afternoon, traveling with the federal convoy after being located by investigators who had tracked down survivors of Blackwood's persecution campaign. She looked healthier than when they had last seen her, with some of the hollowness gone from her eyes and a sense of cautious hope replacing the despair that had characterized her earlier demeanor. "My children are alive," she told them, tears streaming down her face as she shared news that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. "Thomas Jr. and little Mary are at a school in Colorado, and the federal marshals say they can come home within the month." The reunion she described was part of a broader pattern of families being restored throughout the territory as the extent of Blackwood's crimes became clear. Children who had been presumed lost forever were being located at distant institutions, while parents who had been imprisoned on fabricated charges were being released and their records cleared. But the conversation that followed revealed complexities that legal justice could not easily address. Sarah's children had been away from home for nearly 8 months, long enough for significant psychological adjustment to institutional life. Their father's murder and their forced separation from their mother had created trauma that would require careful healing. "The hardest part," Sarah confided, "will be helping them understand why their father died and why they were taken away. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that some people wanted to hurt them simply because of what they looked like?" It was a question that Ayanna knew she would face when Grace was old enough to understand the circumstances surrounding her birth and early life. How could a parent explain racial hatred to a child who embodied the love that such hatred sought to destroy? Marshal Crawford had been listening to their conversation with obvious interest, and he offered insights that suggested the federal government was grappling with similar questions on a much larger scale. What happened here in Arizona Territory is part of a broader pattern we're seeing throughout the West, he explained. Local officials using racial tensions to build political power while profiting from land seizures and government contracts. The Justice Department is committed to stopping such abuse, but lasting change requires more than just arresting corrupt administrators. The systemic nature of the problem became clearer as Crawford described investigations in other territories, where similar patterns of persecution had been discovered. Mixed families were being targeted not just in Arizona, but throughout regions where racial boundaries were seen as essential to maintaining white political and economic dominance. Your case has become a symbol for federal civil rights enforcement, Crawford continued. The fact that you fought back successfully, documented the crimes against you, and survived to testify has inspired other families to come forward with their own stories. The idea that their struggle had encouraged other victims to seek justice was deeply gratifying, but it also meant accepting ongoing responsibility as public symbols of resistance to racial persecution. Privacy would be impossible as long as their case remained in the national spotlight. Colonel Thompson arrived the next morning, traveling with a small military escort and carrying official documents that would formalize the federal government's protection of their family. He had aged noticeably since their last meeting, the stress of coordinating between military, federal, and territorial authorities clearly taking its toll. The President himself has taken an interest in your case, Thompson informed them as they gathered around the cabin's dining table that Mackenzie had crafted from local timber. He views the persecution of mixed families as incompatible with American principles of individual liberty and equal protection under law. The presidential attention was both flattering and somewhat intimidating, suggesting that their private family struggle had become a matter of national policy significance. Grace would grow up knowing that her very existence had influenced federal civil rights enforcement. Thompson spread a collection of legal documents across the table, explaining the various protections and benefits that federal authorities were prepared to provide. Most significant was formal recognition of Grace's American citizenship regardless of her mixed heritage, establishing legal precedent that would protect other mixed children throughout the territories. There's also the matter of Captain Dalton's trust fund, Thompson continued, producing additional papers that documented the financial provisions Dalton had established before his death. The fund has grown considerably due to military death benefits and compound interest. Grace will have substantial resources for education and opportunities when she comes of age. The financial security was welcome, but Ayanna was more interested in the educational opportunities the trust fund would provide. Can the money be used for schooling that teaches both Apache and white ways of learning? The trust specifies that educational decisions should reflect both cultural heritages, Thompson confirmed. James was very specific about wanting his child to understand and appreciate both sides of her ancestry. Over the following days, as federal investigators completed their work and prepared to transport prisoners to trial locations, the valley began to feel peaceful for the first time since Grace's birth. The constant vigilance and fear that had characterized their daily lives gradually gave way to cautious optimism about their family's future. Swift Eagle visited one final time before the Apache warriors who had responded to Ayanna's call returned to their own territories. He came alone, without weapons or war paint, in the diplomatic role of tribal representative, rather than as a warrior responding to emergency. The tribal council has asked me to deliver a message, he said formally, addressing both Ayanna and Mackenzie as equals deserving of respect. Your struggle against those who would harm Apache children has brought honor to your family name despite the circumstances that led to your banishment. The recognition was significant beyond its immediate meaning, suggesting that Ayanna's fight to protect her mixed-blood child had restored her standing within Apache society despite her earlier disgrace. What does that mean for Grace's future relationship with the tribe? Ayanna asked, knowing that her daughter's connection to Apache heritage would be crucial for her cultural identity. It means she will always be welcome among her mother's people, Swift Eagle replied. The Tribal Council recognizes that mixed-blood children may serve as bridges between our world and the white world, helping both peoples understand each other better. The vision of Grace as a cultural bridge, rather than a victim of racial conflict, offered hope for a future where her mixed heritage would be seen as strength rather than liability. She would grow up with access to both Apache wisdom and white opportunities, prepared to navigate complexities that previous generations had found impossible to resolve. As autumn deepened into winter, their isolated valley became a destination for visitors seeking to understand the case that had captured national attention. Newspaper correspondents, federal officials, civil rights advocates, and curious citizens made the journey to interview the family whose resistance had exposed territorial corruption. Ayanna found herself speaking publicly about experiences she had never expected to share beyond her immediate family. The attention was sometimes overwhelming, but she understood that her testimony could protect other mixed families from similar persecution. The most important thing people need to understand, she told a correspondent from the New York Tribune, is that love doesn't recognize the boundaries that politicians try to create. My daughter exists because two people from different worlds found something beautiful together, and no amount of hatred or violence can change that fundamental truth. The article that resulted from that interview was reprinted in newspapers throughout the country, helping to build public support for federal civil rights enforcement, while challenging readers to reconsider their assumptions about racial mixing and cultural boundaries. Mackenzie proved equally eloquent when describing their partnership and his commitment to raising Grace with knowledge of both heritages. This child will grow up understanding that she belongs to both worlds without being limited by either one, he told the Washington Post correspondent. That's the future America needs to embrace if we want to move beyond the racial conflicts that have divided us for too long. On a clear December morning, as snow began falling on the mountains surrounding their valley, Ayanna sat by the cabin's fireplace nursing Grace, while Mackenzie worked on a wooden cradle he was crafting for the baby's first birthday. The peaceful domesticity of the scene represented everything they had fought to preserve and protect. "Do you think she'll understand someday?" Ayanna asked, looking down at her daughter's contented face. "What we went through to keep her safe? She'll understand that she was loved enough for people to risk everything to protect her," Mackenzie replied. "And she'll understand that her existence proved something important about the possibility of different peoples building something beautiful together." Outside their warm cabin, the valley lay pristine under its blanket of fresh snow, unmarked by the violence and hatred that had once threatened to destroy their family. Inside, three people who had found each other through tragedy and circumstance continued building a life based on practical love rather than romantic idealism. Grace stirred in her mother's arms, opening dark eyes that seemed to hold infinite possibility. She was 6 months old now, strong and healthy, with a personality that suggested she would face the world with confidence rather than fear. Whatever challenges her mixed heritage might bring, she would meet them, supported by family who had already proven their willingness to fight for her future. As the snow continued falling and the fire crackled warmly in the hearth, Ayana whispered Apache lullabies, while Mackenzie hummed melodies from his own childhood, creating a musical blend that represented their daughter's dual inheritance. She was Apache and white, American and indigenous, belonging fully to both worlds, because she had parents who refused to accept that such belonging was impossible. The pregnant Apache girl, who had been cast out by her people, had found not just survival, but a new kind of family built on choice rather than blood, commitment rather than convenience. And the mountain man who had offered shelter to a desperate stranger had discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures come not from exploring new territories, but from creating spaces where love can flourish despite the obstacles others try to place in its path. Spring brought unexpected visitors who would reshape their understanding of Grace's place in the world. Rebecca Dalton arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning in March, accompanied by a single escort and carrying herself with the dignified composure of a military widow who had traveled far to confront difficult truths. She was younger than Ayana had expected, perhaps 26, with auburn hair and green eyes that reflected both intelligence and profound sadness. Her traveling dress was well made, but practical, suggesting a woman accustomed to frontier life, despite her obvious refinement. "I am Rebecca Dalton," she announced simply, dismounting near the cabin where Mackenzie was teaching 10-month-old Grace to take her first tentative steps. "I believe you knew my late husband, Captain James Dalton." The moment Ayana had dreaded for months had finally arrived. She emerged from the cabin carrying a basket of mending, her heart pounding as she faced the woman whose husband had fathered her child. The confrontation she had imagined would be filled with anger and accusations, instead began with careful politeness. "Mrs. Dalton," Ayana replied formally, "please accept my condolences for your loss. Your husband was a good man who died trying to do what he believed was right." Rebecca's eyes moved to Grace, who was babbling happily while clinging to Mackenzie's fingers for support. The family resemblance was unmistakable in the child's facial structure and the particular shade of her dark hair that exactly matched James Dalton's coloring. "She has his eyes," Rebecca said quietly, kneeling to Grace's level despite the emotional cost such proximity clearly demanded. "And his stubborn chin. Even as a baby, he would set his jaw exactly that way when he was determined to accomplish something difficult." The gentle observation, delivered without bitterness or accusation, created an atmosphere of shared recognition rather than hostile confrontation. Both women were connected by loss, love, and their relationship to a man whose death had altered both their lives irrevocably. "Why did you come?" Mackenzie asked, though his tone carried curiosity rather than defensiveness. Rebecca stood slowly, brushing dust from her traveling dress while considering how to explain her unexpected journey. "Because I needed to understand what James died for. The official report spoke of duty and military obligations, but I knew there had to be something more personal that drove him to take such risks." She paused, looking around the valley that had become Grace's home. "Colonel Thompson finally told me the truth after the federal investigation concluded, about James's relationship with Miss Clearwater, about the child, about his plans to provide for both of them, despite the complications such arrangements would create. The revelation that Thompson had broken his promise of discretion initially angered both Ayana and Mackenzie, but Rebecca quickly explained the circumstances that had forced his hand. I threatened to petition the War Department for a full investigation. If he didn't explain why James had died on that particular road at that particular time, she said, I knew my husband well enough to recognize when official explanations didn't account for his actual motivations and behavior. Rebecca's intelligence and determination were evident in her successful effort to uncover truth that powerful men had preferred to keep hidden. She had used her position as a military widow to demand accountability from authorities who thought they could manage her grief through comfortable lies. "Are you angry?" Ayana asked directly, needing to understand Rebecca's emotional state before the conversation proceeded further. "I was," Rebecca admitted honestly, "furious at James for betraying our marriage, angry at you for accepting his attention, resentful of the child who represented everything I couldn't give him. But anger exhausts itself eventually, and what remains is the need to understand how to move forward." She watched Grace attempting to walk between Mackenzie and a wooden chair, the child's concentration and determination evident in every careful step. That baby didn't choose the circumstances of her conception, and she shouldn't suffer for the complicated emotions of the adults whose decisions shaped her existence. The mature perspective Rebecca brought to their situation was more generous than anyone had expected, but it also carried implications that would require careful navigation. Her presence meant that Grace's paternal family connections were no longer theoretical, but immediate and personal. "What do you want from us?" Mackenzie asked, though his protective positioning near Grace suggested he was prepared to defend the child regardless of Rebecca's intentions. "I want to know my husband's daughter," Rebecca replied simply. "Not to replace her mother or disrupt the family you've built, but to ensure she understands her full heritage when she's old enough to ask questions about her father's side of the family." The request was reasonable and potentially beneficial for Grace, but it also meant accepting ongoing contact with someone whose presence would serve as a constant reminder of James Dalton's deception and death. Ayana studied Rebecca's face, searching for hidden motives or emotional instability that might make such contact dangerous for Grace's well-being. What she saw instead was a woman struggling with profound loss while trying to honor complicated family obligations. She could benefit from knowing about her father's family, Ayana admitted. But any relationship would need to develop slowly, with consideration for everyone's emotional needs. Rebecca nodded eagerly. "I've been thinking about practical arrangements during my journey here. I inherit James's military pension and death benefits, portions of which could be designated for Grace's care and education, not as charity, but as family obligation." The financial offer was generous, but more important was Rebecca's clear desire to establish legitimate family connections rather than simply providing money and disappearing. She wanted ongoing involvement in Grace's life, despite the emotional complexity such involvement would require. Over the following days, as Rebecca extended her visit to explore the valley and observe the family dynamic she was hoping to join, a remarkable transformation occurred. The jealousy and resentment that might have characterized her interactions with Ayana gradually gave way to mutual respect and even friendship. "You're a remarkable mother," Rebecca told Ayana one afternoon as they watched Grace playing with wooden toys Mackenzie had carved for her first birthday. "James chose well, even if he chose badly." The paradox in her statement captured the complicated nature of their situation perfectly. Dalton's relationship with Ayana had been genuine and meaningful, but it had also been conducted in secret at the expense of his legitimate marriage. "He spoke of you often," Ayana replied carefully, "always with love and respect, though he never mentioned being married. I think he compartmentalized his life in ways that allowed him to avoid confronting the impossible choices he was making." Rebecca's laugh was bitter, but not unkind. "That sounds exactly like James. He had an extraordinary ability to focus on immediate problems while ignoring larger contradictions that might complicate his preferred solutions." Their conversation revealed aspects of Dalton's character that neither woman had fully understood while he lived. He had been capable of genuine love for both women while failing to adequately consider how his divided loyalties would eventually create pain for everyone involved. But their shared understanding of his flaws also created unexpected common ground. Both women had loved a man whose weaknesses had ultimately destroyed him, and both were now responsible for dealing with the consequences of his choices. "Perhaps we can give Grace something James couldn't," Rebecca suggested thoughtfully. "A family that acknowledges complexity instead of trying to hide from it. She'll grow up knowing that love can be real, even when circumstances make it impossible, and that families can be built on choice and commitment rather than just blood relations." The philosophy Rebecca articulated offered a framework for creating relationships that transcended traditional definitions of family legitimacy. Grace could benefit from connections to both sides of her heritage without being burdened by the conflicts that had characterized her parents' relationship. By summer, Rebecca had established residence in a small house in the territorial capital, close enough to visit regularly but far enough away to maintain appropriate boundaries. Her presence provided Grace with access to Dalton family history and Eastern cultural refinement that balanced the Apache and frontier influences of her daily environment. "She's learning to navigate multiple worlds already," Mackenzie observed one evening as they watched 18-month-old Grace switching effortlessly between Apache words Ayanna taught her and English phrases Rebecca used during visits. The linguistic diversity was emblematic of Grace's broader cultural education. She was absorbing Apache traditions about nature and spiritual connection, frontier skills about practical survival, and Eastern refinements about formal education and social interaction. But perhaps most importantly, she was learning that different ways of understanding the world could coexist within a single person. Her mixed heritage was becoming a source of richness rather than confusion, strength rather than division. The federal trials that concluded in late summer provided final vindication. For their struggle against territorial persecution, Harrison Blackwood received a 20-year sentence for conspiracy and civil rights violations, while Marcus Webb and his associates faced similar penalties for their roles in systematic violence against mixed families. "Justice," Ayanna said simply, when Marshall Crawford delivered the verdict news. "Not just for us, but for everyone who suffered under Blackwood's policies." The legal precedents established by their case continued reverberating throughout the territories, providing protection for other mixed families while establishing federal authority over local officials who exceeded their constitutional powers. As Grace approached her second birthday, walking confidently and beginning to form complete sentences that mixed Apache, English, and Spanish words she had learned from various visitors, the family began planning for her formal education. "She'll need schooling that honors all aspects of her heritage," Rebecca insisted during one of their planning sessions. "Apache wisdom, frontier practical skills, and Eastern academic training. Most children receive one or two of those elements, but Grace needs all three to reach her full potential." The educational philosophy they developed was revolutionary for its time, emphasizing cultural integration rather than assimilation. Grace would learn to read Apache pictographs and English literature with equal facility, to understand both Apache, spiritual traditions, and Christian theological concepts, to navigate both tribal councils and territorial courts. "She'll be prepared for any future she chooses," Mackenzie predicted with obvious pride. "Whether she decides to live among Apache people, white society, or create something entirely new that combines both traditions." 2 years after Grace's birth, their valley had become a symbol of successful racial integration that attracted visitors from throughout the country. Scholars, journalists, government officials, and curious citizens made pilgrimages to observe. A family that had transcended traditional racial boundaries while maintaining respect for all cultural traditions involved. "What you've created here," a professor from Harvard University told them during his visit, "represents the future of American society. Integration based on mutual respect rather than forced assimilation. Families built on love rather than racial purity, children raised to appreciate diversity rather than fear it." The academic validation was gratifying, but more important was the practical example they provided for other mixed families throughout the territories. Their success encouraged others to resist persecution and seek federal protection when local authorities exceeded their constitutional authority. As Grace celebrated her second birthday with a party that included Apache relatives, white neighbors, Rebecca's Eastern friends, and federal officials who had become family allies, Ayanna reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of celebration. The pregnant Apache girl who had been cast out by her people had not merely survived, but thrived, creating a new kind of family that honored multiple traditions while building something unprecedented. Her daughter would grow up not as a victim of racial conflict, but as a bridge between worlds, proving that love could indeed transcend the artificial boundaries that others tried to enforce. "What do you think she'll become?" Rebecca asked as they watched Grace distributing pieces of birthday cake to guests with the serious concentration of a child who understood the importance of fairness. "Whatever she wants to become," Ayanna replied confidently. "We've given her the tools to succeed in any world she chooses to inhabit, and the strength to create new worlds if the existing ones prove insufficient." The mountain man who had offered shelter to a desperate stranger had discovered that the greatest adventures involved not conquering new territories, but nurturing possibilities that others considered impossible. Their isolated valley had become a laboratory for demonstrating that different peoples could indeed build beautiful things together when fear gave way to understanding. As the sun set over their mountain home, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that reminded everyone present why this land was worth fighting for, three adults who had found each other through tragedy and choice continued the work of raising a child who embodied hope itself. Grace would carry their legacy forward into a future where her existence proved that love was indeed stronger than hatred, that understanding was more powerful than prejudice, and that families built on choice and commitment could endure any storm. 3 years after Grace's birth, territorial elections brought fundamental changes to Arizona's political landscape. Reform candidates swept into office on platforms promising equal treatment for all citizens, regardless of racial background, directly referencing the injustices exposed during the Blackwood trials. Governor-elect Samuel Morrison made his inaugural visit to their valley in November, arriving with a delegation that included territorial legislators, federal representatives, and members of the press corps. Morrison was a former Union Army officer whose service in integrated regiments had convinced him that racial cooperation strengthened rather than weakened American society. "Your family has become a symbol for what Arizona Territory can achieve when we embrace our diversity rather than fear it," Morrison told them as they stood before the cabin that had become famous throughout the region. "I want to propose something that could benefit both your daughter's future and our territory's development." The governor's proposal was ambitious beyond anything they had imagined. He wanted to establish an integrated educational institution in their valley, using Grace's multilingual development and cultural synthesis as a model for teaching children from all racial backgrounds to work together effectively. "We could build a school that attracts students from Apache bands, white settlements, Mexican communities, and Chinese mining camps," Morrison explained, his enthusiasm evident as he described his vision. "Your daughter would grow up surrounded by children who represent the territory's entire cultural spectrum, all learning from teachers who understand the value of different perspectives. Mackenzie and Ayana exchanged glances that spoke of rapid mental calculation regarding the proposal's benefits and risks. Such an institution would provide Grace with unprecedented educational opportunities while transforming their peaceful valley into a bustling center of activity. "What about security?" Mackenzie asked, remembering the violence they had faced from those opposed to racial integration. An integrated school would attract opponents who might use violence to prevent its success. Federal authorities have committed to providing protection, Morrison replied. The Justice Department views this project as a test case for integration policies they hope to implement throughout the Western Territories. Rebecca, who had been listening intently to the governor's presentation, stepped forward with questions about practical implementation. What age ranges would the school serve? What subjects would be taught? How would you balance different cultural approaches to education? Her queries revealed the sophisticated thinking she had applied to Grace's educational needs during her visits. As a military widow with an Eastern educational background, Rebecca understood the complexities involved in creating truly integrated curricula. We envision starting with elementary education for children aged 6 through 12, Morrison explained. Academic subjects taught in multiple languages, practical skills that honor different cultural traditions, and leadership training that prepares students to serve in territorial government and business. The scope of the proposal was breathtaking, but so were its potential implications for Grace's development. Instead of struggling to find appropriate educational opportunities in a society divided by racial boundaries, she would grow up in an environment where such boundaries were deliberately transcended. Ayana found herself thinking about the Apache, children she had known on the reservation, bright young minds limited by inadequate schools and restricted opportunities. An integrated institution could provide those children with chances for advancement that reservation life could never offer. The Apache tribal councils would need to approve participation, she pointed out. Many tribal leaders remain suspicious of white educational institutions that have historically tried to eliminate Apache culture rather than respect it. That's why your involvement would be essential, Morrison replied. Apache families trust you because of your resistance to persecution and your commitment to maintaining cultural traditions. Your endorsement could convince skeptical parents that their children's heritage would be honored rather than destroyed. Over the following weeks, delegations from various racial communities visited their valley to discuss the educational proposal. Apache leaders, Mexican-American families, Chinese merchants, and white homesteaders all sent representatives to evaluate the potential benefits and risks of integrated education. Swift Eagle arrived, leading an Apache delegation that included several tribal council members and parents of school-aged children. His presence signaled serious consideration of the proposal despite historical Apache resistance to white educational institutions. Our children need to learn the white man's ways without forgetting Apache wisdom, he acknowledged during their discussions. But past experiences with white schools have taught us to be cautious about promises that sound too generous to be genuine. The Apache concerns were entirely reasonable, given the history of boarding schools that had systematically attempted to destroy tribal cultures while providing minimal actual education. Any integrated school would need to prove its respect for Apache traditions through concrete policies and hiring practices. What if Apache families could nominate teachers who would be responsible for cultural education? Ayana suggested. The school could employ Apache educators alongside white and Mexican instructors, ensuring that traditional knowledge receives equal status with academic subjects. The proposal for cultural balance extended beyond Apache concerns to address similar issues affecting other racial communities. Mexican families wanted assurance that Spanish language and Catholic traditions would be respected. Chinese families sought protection for their children against the discrimination they faced in most territorial institutions. Rebecca proved instrumental in developing curricula that addressed these diverse needs. Her Eastern educational background provided models for integrated instruction that had been successfully implemented in some northern states during Reconstruction. We could organize instruction around collaborative projects that require students from different backgrounds to contribute, and their unique knowledge and skills, she proposed during one planning session. Apache children could teach wilderness survival, while white children share arithmetic and reading. Mexican children could lead language instruction, while Chinese children demonstrate traditional arts and crafts. The educational philosophy emerging from their discussions was revolutionary for its emphasis on mutual learning rather than one-way cultural transmission. Instead of minority children being forced to assimilate into white educational models, all students would learn from each other's cultural strengths. By spring, the territorial legislature had appropriated funds for construction of the valley. School, with additional support coming from federal education grants and private donations from Eastern philanthropists interested in integration experiments. Ground was broken in May, with Grace participating in the ceremony by placing the first stone in what would become the school's foundation. At 3 years old, she was already demonstrating the multilingual abilities and cultural synthesis that the institution hoped to nurture in all its students. She speaks Apache to her mother, English to me, and Spanish to the construction workers, Rebecca observed with obvious pride. Yesterday, I heard her teaching Apache counting songs to children from the Mexican families who are helping with construction. Grace's natural ability to bridge cultural differences served as a living demonstration of the school's educational goals. Parents from various communities could see how integrated learning had benefited her development, making them more willing to trust their own children to similar educational approaches. Construction proceeded rapidly through the summer, with families from all racial communities contributing labor and materials according to their abilities. Apache men provided wilderness expertise for site preparation. Mexican craftsmen contributed masonry and carpentry skills. Chinese workers supplied metalwork and decorative elements, while white families organized logistics and financing. The collaborative construction process created relationships that transcended traditional racial boundaries, with children playing together while their parents worked side by side on common objectives. Grace found herself at the center of these interactions, comfortable with children whose parents might have viewed each other with suspicion under different circumstances. She doesn't see racial differences the way adults do, Ayana observed, as they watched Grace organizing a game that included Apache, Mexican, Chinese, and white children. To her, they're just playmates with different languages and customs, not members of competing groups. The child's perspective offered insight into human nature before it was shaped by social prejudices. Integration came naturally to children who had not yet learned to fear or hate people who looked different from themselves. As the school building neared completion in late summer, attention turned to recruiting faculty who could implement the integrated curricula they had developed. The challenge was finding educators who possessed both academic qualifications and genuine respect for cultural diversity. Professor William Chen, a Chinese-American scholar who had faced discrimination at Eastern universities despite his impressive credentials, accepted the position of head instructor after visiting the valley and observing the community's commitment to genuine integration. This represents the future of American education, he told them during his interview. multiple cultures contributing their wisdom to create something greater than any single tradition could achieve alone. Maria Santos, a Mexican-American woman, who had been denied teaching positions at white schools despite her superior qualifications, joined the faculty to lead Spanish language and cultural instruction. Her enthusiasm for the project was evident in her detailed plans for helping students understand the complexity and richness of Mexican heritage. Joseph Crow Feather, the Apache medicine man who had originally exposed Ayana's pregnancy, agreed to serve as cultural advisor and traditional knowledge instructor after extensive discussions with tribal leaders about the school's genuine respect for Apache ways of understanding the world. "This child," he said, watching 4-year-old Grace demonstrate her ability to identify medicinal plants while explaining their uses in 3 languages, has become what we hoped was possible when different peoples learn from each other rather than fighting. The diverse faculty represented exactly the kind of integration the school hoped to achieve among its students. Children would learn from teachers who embodied different cultural traditions while working together toward common educational objectives. Opening Day arrived in September with ceremonies that honored all the cultural traditions represented in the student body. Apache blessing rituals, Mexican Catholic prayers, Chinese ancestor veneration, and Protestant hymns were woven into a celebration that recognized the spiritual diversity of the community they were creating. Grace, now 4.5 years old, served as the unofficial student ambassador, helping newcomers feel welcome while demonstrating the multilingual abilities that had inspired the school's creation. Her comfort with cultural diversity helped other children overcome initial shyness about interacting with students from different backgrounds. "She's teaching them that differences are interesting rather than threatening," Rebecca observed as they watched Grace explaining Apache pictographs to fascinated Chinese and Mexican children during their first week of classes. The educational experiment attracted national attention from scholars, politicians, and social reformers interested in alternatives to the racial segregation that characterized most American institutions. Visitors arrived regularly to observe integrated instruction and interview students about their experiences. "What I see here," reported Dr. Edward Martinez, a professor from Columbia University, challenges fundamental assumptions about racial capability and compatibility. These children are demonstrating that integration enhances rather than diminishes educational achievement. Academic assessments confirmed that students in the integrated environment were outperforming their peers in segregated institutions, particularly in areas requiring creative problem-solving and collaborative thinking. The diverse perspectives each cultural group contributed seemed to stimulate intellectual development in ways that homogeneous instruction could not match. By Grace's 5th birthday, the Valley School had become a model for integration efforts. Throughout the Western Territories, government delegations, educational reformers, and curious citizens made pilgrimages to observe what many considered the most successful racial integration experiment in American history. What started as one family's struggle for survival has evolved into a demonstration of what America could become, Governor Morrison reflected during his 2nd annual visit. "Your daughter has grown up proving that our differences strengthen rather than divide us when we approach them with wisdom and respect." Grace herself seemed unaware of her symbolic significance, focused instead on the daily adventures of childhood in an environment that celebrated curiosity and learning. She moved effortlessly between Apache traditions and academic subjects, Spanish conversations and wilderness expeditions, Chinese calligraphy and Protestant prayers. "She embodies the future," Ayana said as they watched their daughter teaching younger students to weave Apache baskets while reciting multiplication tables in 3 languages. Not Apache or white or Mexican, but American in the truest sense of what that word could mean. The mountain man, who had offered shelter to a cast-out pregnant woman, had discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures involve not conquering new territories, but creating spaces where the impossible becomes inevitable. Their valley had become proof that love truly was stronger than hatred, that understanding could overcome prejudice, and that families built on choice rather than chance could indeed change the world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.